property investors today. I want to have a chat with you. For those who might have been following, I've been being bothered by Mr. X, right? So we're going to have a conversation today for the next 10 minutes to 15 minutes because I intend on being on time. I intend on making sure that, yes, we limit the time to 20 past. But, you know, today I want to have a conversation. I think what we're going to do, we're going to go on a journey. We're going to go on a journey of wealth creation and wealth preservation from tax and wealth management perspective. The reality is that people, when they start the journey of creating wealth, there's a tendencies of making issues of tax an afterthought. And the reality is that when it comes to that, it comes with its own challenges. I'll give a scenario. Let's say, for instance, you've got a couple of properties. You've been making money on properties. Would you agree with me? And then you later on realize that you want to preserve wealth. And wanting to preserve wealth, you're considering things of trust of this world. You're doing a couple of estate planning there and then, and you meet Shilly Boy from Intergen and the tax areas and say, Shilly Boy, I want to transfer these assets and I want to move them into more so-called investment structure that I can think of intergenerational wealth. How many of us every day sing the song of intergenerational wealth? But what does it mean? And what does it even expect us to behave in what format? Now, let's take a step back. The moment then you are Mr. X and you move those properties into a structure, say assets, say a company that is owned by the trust, as typically you'll find in most of the basic, so-called basic wealth preservation investment structures. Now, Mr. X asked me, Shilly Boy, in this context, do I still own or do I still have an influence in these properties that I transfer? And when I shared these with various people, I realized how much of the basics or the understanding of separation between the ownership, right, and the control, and versus the enjoyment or the benefits that comes with investment structure that has to do with trust. And it got me thinking to say, maybe let's take a step back and understand, if you are going to go on a journey of trying to protect wealth and utilizing tools like, because there's a many way, by the way, there are many ways to preserve wealth. It's not only trust. Trust is one of the tools. I mean, these days people use foundations, non-profit organizations. You can use some insurance product to protect your wealth. You can do a various advanced tax planning that we will keep talking about that as time goes on, right? Now, what happens if you are Mr. X, you have these properties, and then you move them into either company or trust? Okay, in this scenario, let's make it as Mr. X move these properties into a trust. Does Mr. X still owns the properties? Of course, he doesn't. From legal point of view, we know that there's been a change of ownership from his personal name, right, into the trust. But then there's an issue of psychological position now, which happens a lot around family-owned businesses or around an individual who's on a journey of creating wealth, whether you're a farmer, as long as you are individual creating wealth, you'll always have difficulties of distancing yourself from the business you co-founded or you founded and your personal assets, your normal bank account, your normal. I always give a scenario. How many of us right now, as I speak to you, you've got in your wallet a business bank account? Bank card relating to the business account, right? How often or how frequently do you use without approval? Remember, approval can be you alone saying, I approve to use business money. And then this business money, I use it, then I classify it, whether it's a dividends or I classify it as a loan, because it needs to be classified as long as you use it for your personal use. I digress. Now let's go back to scenario. I was trying to illustrate a practical example of why people suffer from separating themselves from their own personal estate versus that of the company. Now, you've got a scenario then where you moved, imagine if you've owned 3-5 multi-lets over the years, and then now you move those properties under the hands or the ownership of the trustees. Would you agree with me? The mental separation or the mental shift is not easy. Now, and this is where we get it wrong. We got it wrong because the moment you move these assets into this investment structure, be it a trust, be it a company, and you still behave as if those assets are still in your personal name. You just change the ownership, by the way, legal ownership, but the behavior, the usage, the influence is still the same. Would you agree with me? You blurred the lines between the notion that is the fundamental reasons why trust exists, which is to separate the control and ownership versus the enjoyment of those trust assets. Now, where Mr. X struggles with, it's with the context of saying, do I still have an influence and control and ownership of those assets that belongs to the trust? Legally speaking, you shouldn't. If you want to create intergenerational wealth, you should not be in a position where you are actually having control, that material control, that it blurs the lines on whether you actually intended to have the trust. Would you agree with me? So I don't want to find a situation where you've got a trust, you've got a bank card in your wallet, and you go on a soft life spree. You are actually working backwards. The reality is that the moment you move all your assets for preservation, for intergenerational wealth, into a form of a structure, you need to ensure that now you respect the hierarchy or you respect the lines. Similar to the individuals who own a company, forget even a trust. If then let's say you are in this individual owning a company, how many of us, you went to Peg and Pay of this world, as an example, nothing wrong with going to Peg and Pay, and you go and then swipe items that are for domestic use. Would you agree with me that you blur the lines? Because that is not a true legal position that you should be taking, because those are basic things from wealth management and from tax management point of view gets us into trouble. Because the reality is that the moment you use business or for the moment you use resources of an independent taxpayer, let's say in this context, you being the owner of the company, would you agree with me? Such movement, it needs to be classified, whether being a loan or distribution. In this context, could be dividends or could be a return of your initial capital investment in that particular business. So the moment you don't classify it, would you agree with me? You will find yourself in the tax problems. So imagine in a context where now you go and you swipe for that expensive dream of your car. You're driving that Ferrari, you're driving that Porsche as an example. There's nothing wrong with driving those things, but it's how you go about purchasing those things, because the reality is that you might find yourself having blurred the lines and then coming to have a complaints when we have to collect certain taxes from you and then having to blame some of us. But the reality is that what I'm trying to emphasize and what I'm trying to, as a take home, is the fact that you need to be clear on what is the purpose or what is the classification of that movement of the money between yourself and the company, so that we're able to account it in a more tax efficient way. Because the reality that if that money is not being classified properly and you use it for personal use, would you agree with me that there's a huge chances that we're actually not complying with the tax legislations? So, and also from wealth management point of view, to me, that is not a proper good governance, even from financial literacy point of view or from wealth management point of view. It's not a good way to preserve or to protect the well-being of your business if you're intending on a business to actually function correctly. You already got into trouble with a taxman. Now you're also getting into problem with the sustainability of the business. And I think that's the mental blockage or mental shift that keeps holding us back. Now, in closing, I bring it back to the issue of having to deal with the separation between the assets that you moved into the trust. In closing, what I'm trying to emphasize is that the moment you move your wealth into the structure, let's say we did a nice tax plan for you, you know your position, everything is clean. Now, the administration and the efficient administration, the basic administration, is to understand that the so appointed trustees are the one now who are legally owning those properties. And I understand they own from legal point of view, but not from economic benefits point of view. This is where it gets tricky, this is where it gets very fancy when it comes to trust, because you legally own, but you can't benefit from it. And I think that's very interesting. When you're a trustee of a trust, you legally own the trust assets, but you're not entitled to benefit from them economically. Will you agree with me? Unless you're a beneficiary of, which I always say I wouldn't be comfortable in most cases unless the situation dictate otherwise, that you find the founder being a trustee, unless you don't have a choice, but in most cases avoid being there. Now, the part in short is that once you've got those appointed trustees, they need to act jointly. We can't be having a superpower trustee who decides on matters as of the trust on their own, and then the rest of the trustees just rubber stamping. It doesn't work that way. So we need to deliberate and discuss matters that affects those trust assets of the well-being of the trust jointly. And then thereafter, decision has to be reduced into a form of resolutions. The drafting can always be delegated. And this is where the likes of professional trustees like Intergen, they come in, where they can assist with professionally drafting such kind of documentation, because then there's an element of documentation that is necessary to govern the process that was taken to arrive at those conclusions. And that's how you're going to manage that. And that's how you're going to actually make sure that there's a separation between the founder of the trust and the beneficiaries. Now, in short, closing, now once you separate that element, you are fiduciary obligated and responsible to account to who? To the beneficiaries. Yes, the beneficiaries are in charge, even though there might be so-called discretionary or contingent beneficiaries. But however, they can hold you accountable. They can request and have, they've got rights, certain rights, like rights to have access to the trust informations and things like that. So now you still have to account to them. So they might have a vested, or they might have contingent, what so-called discretionary, that trustees have to exercise at the end of the day, right? Now, that is the basic understanding and crucial element of trust formation to be able to have a proper and sound wealth management foundation. Because the reality is that one of the mistakes is we work so hard in wealth creation, but our ability and a position of always making the wealth management and the tax planning and afterthought always get us into this. So now and then, every Wednesday from 5 o'clock, let's talk about practical mistakes, and that most people, wealth creators, they do from tax point of view and from wealth management point of view, which elements of financial literacy and things like that. And I'll be taking some of for those obviously also who wants to join me, can join me in Zoom and ask those questions. We've got 20 minutes from 5 to 20 past 5 every Wednesday. And we're gonna discuss this issue of tax, the basic practical scenarios that gets us into trouble as ordinary folks when it comes to preserving the little wealth that you're working so hard for. I wish you well, property investors, wealth creators. Let's have a conversation. My name is Shilly Boy. Thank you so much. And yeah, good evening. Good luck.